This morning's message is entitled, How Did We Get Here? How did we get here? That is a question I hear all the time. Sometimes I hear people saying that in this sense, in kind of a positive way, where people say, boy, I am so blessed. How did I end up with this family, with this beautiful wife, or this amazing husband, or these great kids? How did I end up here? Boy, I don't deserve this grace that I'm receiving. Or how did I end up with this great job, which fits me perfectly? And I love hearing that. I love hearing people give testimony of them saying, wow, God's been good to me, and I realize I have all these things in my life that I don't deserve. So people say, how did we get here in that respect? Often I hear it in this sense. Man, how did I end up in this broken relationship? How did I end up divorced? How did I end up in this dead-end job? How did I end up with this broken, diseased body? I mean, how did I get here? How did I end up addicted? All of us have experienced addiction in one form or another in our lives, and we can feel like, gosh, how did I end up here? I didn't realize it would take me this low. So I hear it in that way, too. And in one sense, the difference between the latter, the negative perspective, and the former, the positive perspective, in one sense, the difference between the two is how we are either seeing God or not. How we are seeing His character, His activity in our lives or not. And we don't, around here at our church, believe in just sort of pat answers or little sentimental ideas, little hallmark statements that we throw out there. We believe life is complex and challenging and hard, and it's not as simple as just flipping a switch, or it's not as simple as just one sermon. I don't believe when I get up here that one message is going to fix you forever. I don't believe that, but I do believe that each message can help you see maybe a little bit more clearly who your God is. Help you trust maybe a little bit more in His character. Help you see a little bit more in your life how He's involved in the details. And so as we ask this question, how do we get here? Whether that's in a positive sense only, and we really want to see, wow, God, how did you get me here and all this common grace blessings that I have? Or in the more negative sense where you're struggling with something, and how did I get here in that sort of discouraged feeling? Either way, there's going to be help for you here. You're going to see God working. This is what's most amazing about what we're going to look at today. We're going to see God working in the details of the lives of His people back then, and it's the same God working in the details of our lives today. We're going to look at the story. So we're in Exodus 1, and we're actually going to end up going back to Genesis again. So if you're here last week for the introductory message, we went back to Genesis all the way back to Abram or Abraham, same guy. And we saw some important things. We're going to see some important things about his descendants this morning, and that's where Exodus 1 points us. But before we go there, two more preliminary thoughts. First of all, it is fascinating that God, as we look at Exodus, we see a story of people, a story of families, a story of a nation. And as I, in my own study over the years, have looked at other religions and other philosophies, it's rare that religious books and the teachings of religious gurus would include so many stories. But God is a storyteller. And He reveals truth through stories, through the lives of individuals. And so we're going to be brought into that this morning, which is awesome. And we love stories. We watch movies and TV shows and Netflix specials, and we get drawn into stories. Well, God's going to draw us into a story as we go through this book together. And we're going to see 4 truths about God in this story that unfolds before us. Okay, 4 truths. I'm going to just list them up front, and then we'll walk through them in the text. Number 1, we're going to see that God is in control of where we end up. God is in control of where we end up. Number 2, God is in control of our prosperity. Number 3, God is in control of our opposition. Any challenges, opposition, even hostility of others against us, God is in control of that. And 4th, God is in control of our burdens, the burdens we bear. Okay? That's what we're going to see as we go through this text this morning. So let's start by reading Exodus 1, just the first 5 verses for now. under this heading, God is in control of where we end up. Okay, first 5 verses. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel. Here's this family, the sons of Israel, who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household. And here are the 12 sons of Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. So we have this family, the Israelites, the sons of Jacob, in Egypt with their wives, with their children. And it says at this point, there are 70 people. If you were here last week, you remember. If you weren't, here's what we looked at. We looked at Abraham and the promises God made to him, where he says, Abraham, look, I know that you and your wife cannot conceive children at this point, but I'm going to miraculously provide a child for you. And through that child, a great nation is going to rise up. He promised Abraham that he would do that in his life. And we're seeing here the fruition of that to a degree. We see that he's had children. That he had Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, and those are the sons I just listed in verses 2 through 4. Those 12 children, all a result of the fulfillment of the promises of God made way back generations ago to Abraham, the patriarch, the true patriarch of Israel, the true father of Israel. Okay? So there's this family. But they are not, and part of the promise to Abraham was, this is really important, not only would they have descendants and a nation would rise up, and not only would they be blessed and a blessing to the people around them, but he said, this is really important, they would have a land. They would have the promised land, a place to call home, a place to grow and thrive and spread out, flourish. However, here we are in Exodus 1. And where were they? The end of verse 5. Are they in the promised land? Where are they? They're in Egypt. They're stuck in Egypt. And they've been in Egypt for a time. How'd they get there? I want to show you the God of the details, okay, and how this family ended up in Egypt. And again, I think you're going to be blown away by the amazing ways God worked. So turn back to Genesis 37. Genesis 37. This is the story of Joseph. Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. The family we looked at Exodus 1, this is Joseph, okay? The second youngest son, I think, if I have the order right. We're going to read Genesis 37, 1 through 36. Follow along with the story. I'll make some comments along the way, but just sort of in your mind's eye, just picture this family and what's playing out here, okay? So Genesis 37, verses 1 and following, says, Now Jacob, there's the father, Jacob lived in the land where his father, Isaac, had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. That is closer to the promised land. In one sense, was the promised land. They were living there at that time, many years ago, with respect to Exodus 1. Verse 2, These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a vari-colored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. So stop here for a moment. Here we have this family, and can we say, here we have this dysfunctional family. Right away we see, first of all, Joseph is kind of a snitch, and his dad favors him. He's playing favorites. Everybody knows that's not cool, but that's exactly what's going on here. We have this good Christian family, not so good. Okay? Shambles. Brothers hated Joseph, not surprisingly. Hated him. Couldn't even speak to him on friendly terms. Despised him. All right, keep reading. Then Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And you can't blame him. The guy's kind of dumb. He keeps telling them all. Listen, look what he says. He said to them, Please listen to this dream which I have had. I mean, if he can't pick up on the fact they don't like him very much, like something's wrong with this guy. So he says, Hey, everybody sit down. I want to tell you about this awesome dream I had. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field. Now, the word sheaves is weird. It's like almost a King James word. Greg, almost. It's hard. What does that mean? It's the binding together of stalks of grain, okay? In the agricultural world, it's like all these stalks tied together. So all these bunches or bundles of stalks, he says, in the dream, we were binding sheaves in the field, harvesting. And lo, my sheaf rose up and stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to mine. Then his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Like, this kid doesn't get it. Keep going. Verse 9. Now he had still another dream, and related it to his brothers again, and said, lo, I've had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars. 11 stars, it's the number of his brothers, right? All 11 of them were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him. He's going to be like concerned for his son's life at this point. Like, what are you doing? Said to him, what is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come down to bow ourselves before you? What are you talking about, man? You're out of your mind. Verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So his father somewhere sort of logged that and said, maybe there's something to that. His father knew full well by experience in his family that God worked through dreams, didn't he? He would speak to his people through dreams, and he knew they said, maybe there's something to this, but he's kind of like, can you take it easy here, Joseph, with this stuff? Verse 12, then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come and I will send you to them. And he said, I will go. It's kind of his role often, apparently. Then he said to him, go now, see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now I want you to just consider the details of this. Like, what are the chances of this happening? So do you get what's happening? The dad, Jacob, sends Joseph to go check on his brothers to see, hey, how are they doing? And come and report back to me. Again, he's the snitch, okay? So he's always the one kind of reporting, the informant, all right? Probably those of you with kids, you have like a kid who tends to be the informant. He's always going to come and rat out the other kids, right? So he goes, go find out what's going on and come bring word back to me. So he sends him out, and he goes to this place, Shechem, and he gets to Shechem, and his brothers aren't there. He doesn't see him. So he's looking around the fields, he's looking all around, he doesn't see him. But a man found him, and it says, and behold, verse 15, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, hey, what are you looking for? And he just so happens to bump into this guy, and this guy is nice enough to say to him, hey, what are you doing? What are you looking for? Can I help you out? Verse 16, he said, I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they're pasturing the flock. In other words, have you seen them? Do you know where they are? And the man said, they have moved from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. I mean, do you get how significant that is? This guy just happens to bump into Joseph while he's looking for his brothers. They're not anywhere to be found. I don't know how many people are around or whatever, but he just happens to bump into this guy. And the guy tells him, oh yeah, I heard them. Must have been close enough to overhear them saying they were going to another place called Dothan. Now, can you just sort of, in a foreshadowing way, I mean, if Joseph didn't bump into that guy and hear that they were in Dothan, none of what's about to happen would have happened. See how important that is? That he ran into just this one guy who happened to hear the brothers talking. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. When they saw him from a distance, I'm in verse 18 now, before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, a wild beast devoured him, and then let us see what becomes of his great dreams. Hey, let's put an end to this kid. Had enough of him. And we can just kind of make up, well, he was attacked by a wild beast. We can just kind of tell that story and cover up. But Reuben, and Reuben is the oldest, kind of typical oldest, responsible one. Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, let us not take his life. Here again, I can just say quickly, hey, what if Reuben never heard them conspiring? What if they just did it and he didn't happen to overhear them saying it? But he did. So Reuben further said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him. And then privately, Reuben was kind of scheming, thinking, I got to rescue him at the end of verse 22, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped him of his tunic the vari-colored tunic that was on him, the sort of symbol of his favoritism with the Father. And they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal. So Joseph's stuck in this pit, and they're just sitting around to eat a meal. As they raised their eyes, look, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Instead, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for after all, he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up, lifted Joseph out of the pit, sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph to Egypt. So you see, they changed their plan. Hey, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him. Let's make some money off him. And again, we can say, hey, what are the chances they're out there, wherever they are, happen to be on this trade route, and they just happen to have these Midianites passing through who are on their way to Egypt. Perfect opportune time. And they say, hey, let's just sell him to these guys. And they're okay with it. So they sold him for 20 shekels of silver, the price of a common slave. And they brought Joseph to Egypt. This is how Joseph ends up in Egypt. Do you appreciate the details here? The way God was working? Any little change in the storyline, and it could have gone very different. But it was all according to plan. A few more verses here. We'll finish this chapter out, okay? It says, and now Reuben, the oldest, returned to the pit. Behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his garments. The first time, he was able to thwart the plan of his brothers when they wanted to kill him. He heard it, and he stopped them from killing him. This time, he didn't hear. He couldn't intervene, and it's too late. He's already been sold. So he returned to his brothers and said, the boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go? What am I going to do now? I can't go home. Basically, Dad's going to kill me. So they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a male goat, dipped the tunic in the blood, and they sent the vari-colored tunic and brought it to their father and said, we found this. Please examine it to see whether it's your son's or not. Then he examined it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast must have devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. So Jacob, the father, concludes, he must have been killed. So Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. I mean, do you appreciate the pain here? He's saying, look, I'm going to die. This pain's going to kill me. I mean, the loss of his son, he couldn't be comforted. And his other sons, the brothers of Joseph, know all along that they did this. Can you imagine the turmoil there? Again, this is not some upright, together family. Like, this is a complete disaster. And these brothers are sort of living with this guilt and trying to go on like, it was an accident, but they know that it was their fault. It says, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. So fast forward with me. At that time, Joseph was 17 years old. Fast forward an additional 17 years. 17 years later, here's what's happened in the interim. First of all, Joseph's father, Jacob, is grieved the loss of his son. His brothers have gone on with life, apparently, getting away with their crime against their brother, or at least they thought so. Joseph, meanwhile, we can't look at all the text, but I encourage you, if you want to go back and read it, just read chapter 37 on. If you watch his life, guess what his life's like? It's like a roller coaster. I mean, at times he prospers, he's promoted. In Potiphar's house, he's just a worker in the beginning, but then Potiphar has favor for him, so he elevates Joseph there, gives him a position of responsibility, but then Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph, and he resists her, and then he gets in trouble for that. And this guy's life for 17 years is just a roller coaster. Probably at times thinking, wow, maybe that dream is going to come true. And other times thinking, this is ridiculous. This is a joke. God's playing games with me. I'm stuck. I'm lost. I mean, night after night after night, this guy goes to bed. He's away from everything he knew, away from his family. He's been betrayed. He's been sinned against in an egregious way. And all evidence is that this is just a complete sham in terms of what he had hoped for and expected. So just put yourself in his shoes, and it's just a roller coaster. Well, then he's elevated again later, and the way it plays out over and over, it says God was with him. If you read the text several times, it says God was with him. Probably at times he felt it, probably at times he didn't, but God was with him nevertheless. And he ends up second in command in all of Egypt beneath Pharaoh. He ends up being promoted in the end, having interpreted some dreams and some other things happen, and Pharaoh promotes him to second in command over the whole empire of Egypt. And then, turn to Genesis 45. In an amazing twist, turn of events, there's a famine back in Canaan where his brothers were still living all those years. Severe famine, threatening to kill everybody. But Joseph in Egypt had made plans. God had given him revelation. He had made plans for that famine. He had stockpiled plenty of food to sustain the people for those years of famine. And his brothers end up journeying to Egypt to beg for provisions because their lives are at stake. And in God's providence, guess where they end up? Right before the throne of Joseph. Almost 20 years has gone by. They haven't seen him in all these years. And in an unsuspecting way, they end up before their brother, before his throne, under his authority, really. So Genesis 45, a few things we'll look at here. It says then, and here the scene, I'm just going to give you the context. So the scene is they're before his brother. They don't realize who he is. He realizes who they are. And then we pick it up in verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, "Have everyone go out from me." So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. I mean, they were literally speechless. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God." You see, like 3 times he repeats, this was God's plan, God's plan, God's plan. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of all his household, ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go to my father and say to him, "Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down, do not delay." And then Joseph says this, "You shall live in the land of Goshen," Goshen's a very important geographical location because it was the most fertile and fruitful part of Egypt. And Joseph says, under the Pharaoh's rule and under my rule, you're going to live in the best land Egypt has to offer. He says, I'm going to take care of you. So he says, you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come. You and your household and all that you have will be impoverished. Behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth which is speaking to you. Now you must tell my father of all of my splendor in Egypt and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. Just a few more verses. Then he fell on his brother's Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all of his brothers and wept on them, and afterward his brothers talked with him. Now when the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts, go to the land of Canaan, take your father, all in your household, and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat of the fat of the land. Now you're ordered, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father, and come. Do not concern yourselves with goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours." I mean, is that amazing? It's amazing how God sovereignly, providentially governed all the details to get this family into Egypt, to get them to be in the place where they belong, exactly where they were supposed to be. God had them exactly where they were supposed to be, and he governed all the details of their lives, including Joseph just happened to bump into that guy who happened to tell him that his brothers were in Dothan, and then he went there. And then Reuben happened to be able to thwart one plan but not another. Do you see? I mean, all the things that happened, it just played out perfectly so that Joseph would end up in Egypt all these years later in an exalted position and could provide for his family. That they would come and live in the best of Egypt so that they could multiply and flourish and thrive there. And generations earlier, when God promised Abraham blessing, descendants, a nation, and a land, he said, and he said sort of parenthetically, your descendants will live in a land that is not their own for 400 years, and they will live under oppression, but then I will give them even more at the end of that, and they will come out. So years earlier, God had predicted all this. It's all playing out according to his plan, which is just amazing. So go back to Exodus 1 and think about this for a minute. I know you look back in your life and you see things that just don't make sense to you. Things that happened, decisions you made, relationships you got involved in or left behind, financial decisions you made, career decisions you made. And for some of you, that can be a bitter thing to look back and say, gosh, how did I end up here? And you see those details and you're discouraged by them. And maybe there was a lot of sin involved on your part and the part of other people, and that even more just sort of echoes through your mind this message that, you know what, you're just stuck. You know what, God's just sort of let you make a mess of your life. And now you're destined to live with all the bitter consequences of it. And it's just dark and hopeless. I know for some of you, you feel that way. Some of you don't. Some of you, as I said earlier, you look back and say, wow, you can see God's hand in this and this and this, and you're thankful. And those of you look back and you're just distressed. Either way, God was over it all. He was involved in the details of your life, just like he was involved in the details of their lives. This is who he is. He's consistent. This is how he operates. So when it comes to how do we end up where we are, how do we end up maybe in our dysfunctional family we have, just like Jacob's family? How do we end up here? Answer, ultimately, God. Yeah, you made choices. Other people made choices. Good things happened. Bad things happened. And God says, hey, ultimately, it's all good, and it's all part of the plan. It's God. And this is something just amazing in that. At the end of Joseph's life, this one last thing from Genesis, in the end of chapter 50, the very end of Genesis, Joseph, his brothers are fearful, and understandably, they're thinking, gosh, he's going to, at some point, like this Mr. Nice Guy is going to go away, and he's going to take revenge on us. I mean, it makes sense, right? After what they put him through, and all the suffering he endured for all those years. And they're thinking, gosh, we got to figure out something. So they say, hey, by the way, and by this point, their dad, Jacob, had died, and say, hey, by the way, Dad's dying wish was that you'd be nice to us. Once again, just kind of scheming, right? So, hey, just want you to know. And you know what Joseph says to him? He says, am I in God's place? Is it for me to dole out any kind of retribution? He says, no. He says, look, this is one of the most fascinating and probably perplexing statements in all the Bible. But here's what he says. He says, listen, this is Genesis 50, verse 20. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. So in all that played out in Joseph's life, there's a lot of evil involved, including on Joseph's part. And looking back, he says, look, you had evil intentions. And in those same events, those same activities, God was behind the scenes with good intentions. There's some mystery in that. But there's also great encouragement in that. That anything that happens, no matter how dark, God has good intentions for. So how do we end up where we ended up? It's God. His intentions, his plans. We're going to go a couple more verses in Genesis or Exodus 1, just a little farther. That's sort of the main point I wanted to make, but a few more points that sort of fit with it. Secondly, God's in control of your prosperity. So they're in Goshen, and they are prospering. And so verse 6 and 7 says, Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty so that the land was filled with them. And they lived in the best land in Egypt, and they're prospering, they're flourishing, and it's great. And here's what I don't think we're going out on a limb here too much to assume this, even though I'm reading between the lines some. Probably because of human nature being what it is, probably along the way, as they're prospering, they're kind of like forgetting God. They're just kind of enjoying the good stuff, enjoying the good life, enjoying the best of the land, enjoying the relative freedom they had, probably not reflecting on the kindness of God and probably not depending upon God, probably not understanding and appreciating the finite and limited nature, fragile nature of all they were enjoying. I'm guessing here they're probably somewhat comfortable, excuse me, and somewhat apathetic. I'm guessing. And God allowed that, didn't he? I mean, who was over Joseph and Pharaoh that they would say, come and live in the best of the land so they could grow like this? So God's in control of prosperity, and that's the same for us. Later in Deuteronomy 8, God will say to his people, hey, just don't forget, when you get in the good land, the promised land, you're enjoying all the blessings of that. He says, remember the Lord your God, for it's he who is giving you the power to make wealth, even the power you have to get a degree, to get a job, to make money. God's giving all of that to you. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, what do you have that you didn't receive? And if you've received it, why do you boast as if you didn't receive it? Everything you have, every single solitary thing you have is a gift to you. And you say, well, I worked hard. I punched the clock. I worked overtime. Well, who allowed you to have the health to be able to do that? The mental ability to be able to do that? Who allowed you the relationships of support that enabled you to do that? God is behind all of it. So God is in control of our prosperity and even allows us to become apathetic at times. Thirdly, God is in control of the opposition. This is, truly mind-boggling. Fits with what we've said so far, but in maybe even more of a clear way. But look at verse 8. It says, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So there's a new king in town, new sheriff in town, okay? He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we are. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply. In the event of war, they will join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so they were in dread of the sons of Israel. So now you have opposition. In the world we live in, whether it's political entities, business entities, corporations, whether it's you and your family and your endeavors, is always competition, isn't there? If I'm going to have the best of the best, then anyone who rises up with power is a threat to what I have. Now they're seeing the Israelites prospering, and they're saying, hey, they're a threat to us. And many, many generations have gone by. Probably hundreds of years have gone by, and they're not remembering Joseph and all that he had done to benefit the nation. All that's long gone in their minds. All they're seeing is this threat. And so now they say, we've got to suppress, we've got to put them down and crush them under weight so that they can't thrive like this anymore. And I'm going to turn you to a place to see something that's, again, striking. Turn to Psalm 105 for a minute. Psalm 105. And I just want you to hear this and see it for yourself. Psalm 105. Many of the psalmists referred back to the Exodus and what happened there. It was, in the Old Testament, it is like the most important event of the Old Testament, arguably. And so they often reflected on it. And listen to what this inspired psalmist says about what happened there. Verse 23, Israel also came into Egypt. Thus Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. And he caused his people, that is God caused his people to be very fruitful there and made them stronger than their adversaries. He, verse 25, that is God, turned their heart to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. So even this ill will, this malice on the part of the Egyptians, who was behind it ultimately? God was behind it. The psalmist, inspired by God, says he turned their hearts to hate his people. to oppress them, to afflict them. Do you see how God is at work behind the scenes? I mean, can we just admit for a second, part of us doesn't like this? I mean, God is not the author of evil. He's not making people think evil thoughts and do evil things. He is not. He is only good. He's only kind. He's only loving. But he has good, kind, loving intentions for allowing and even tinkering with the hearts of men some. We're going to see that later with Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. God does that. And why is it? And this is where we're coming to a climax here, okay? We're building to a climax. Back to Exodus 1. He is he's preparing his people for salvation. Because we humans are so apt to be independent, so apt to just go it alone, do things our way, walk as if God doesn't exist or as if we don't need him to exist. Because we're just so apt to just press on with bigger, better, more, and invite a whole host of problems and invite destruction into our lives and destruction into our relationships and misery for ourselves and misery for others. We have a compassionate, sovereign God who sees that and who intervenes, who orchestrates all the details to rescue us. And in this moment right here, he is setting his people up for rescue, for salvation, to come and save the day, to help them see, you need me. You think you don't, but you do. And if God wasn't loving and if he wasn't caring, he'd say, fine, have it your way. Go ahead, destroy yourself. Destroy everybody else around you. Have at it. But he's not that way. So he acts and he intervenes. The last verses, 13 to 14. This is God is in control of the burdens you bear. The Egyptians compelled, look at, by the way, all the words that speak of work here. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field. All their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. In the words rigor and labor, it speaks of just where'd the Israelites end up? Prospering, comfortable, probably apathetic, and now they're just crushed and beaten down and exhausted, laboring, toiling. Why? To survive. This is their only hope for survival. They don't have a choice. It's grueling. Wearing them down to nothing. So question, as you think about your life, where are you laboring the most? Where do you feel the most weighed down, the most burdened? Where do you feel like you're fighting for survival the most? In what relationship? You are trying to control that spouse, that child, that person at work. You got to get them to be a certain way for you, because if you can't get them to be that way, then you can't flourish and thrive. And so you're working and working and working at it, and you're exhausted under the weight of all of it. And the sinner in your life is not cooperating. They're opposing you. They're oppressing you. Where is that happening in your life? And you just feel burdened. And all that's coming out of you is resentment and anger and hate. And you're turning to the same old things, the same old addictions, the same old distractions, just to try to get a little bit of breath of air to keep going, and it just keeps failing you. And you feel wiped out. And part of you, the despairing part of you says, there's nothing, there's no meaning in this. I'm just stuck. Where is that happening in your life? What God is communicating to us this morning is that he is behind the scenes. He's working in every aspect of what's going on in your life. Every single aspect of it. And whatever it is, it's making you work and strive and toil. And the outworking of that, the expressions of that, anxiety and fear and greed and cravings and lust and anger and hostility and conflict and depression and misery, all that underneath it is I got to provide for myself. I got to make it. I got to live. and you're a slave. And God says, I'm coming for you. I mean, you almost feel it here, because if you know what's coming in this book, you just almost sense it. He's coming for him. He's coming to set him free. He's coming to set him free. God's heart is a heart of a liberator, seeing people in their misery and affliction, who says, I want to come and set you free. There's that Old Testament passage, I think it's Isaiah, and Jesus quotes it when he comes on the scene. He starts to do ministry, and he says, God sent me to proclaim liberty to the slaves, to give sight to the blind, set the captives free. It's the heart of God. And the ultimate fruition of it all is the greater Joseph. The ultimate fulfillment. The greater Joseph, Jesus Christ, who lived amongst his own. He came to his own, and his own received him not. They betrayed him. They turned him over. And just like God was sovereign over the details and even the evil that happened to Joseph, God was sovereign over the details of Jesus' life and the evil that happened to him. His betrayal all throughout his life and ministry, his betrayal in the end when he was tried and executed on the cross. And just like God's intention with Joseph was to preserve many people alive, to through the evil of humans, to actually grant life, to grant provisions. In that case, thousands of years ago, many thousands of years ago, to give them food to eat and to live. Well, now through the cross and through the gospel, God says, I'm giving you food to eat and to live. Jesus is your life now. He's your living bread. He's your living water. You eat this bread, you drink this water, you'll never hunger, you'll never thirst. You have in him everything you need. That's freedom. And you don't work for it and you don't toil for it. It's not about paying God anything. It's about just receiving. It's about being in the prison cell and he shows up and says, hey, it's time to come home. Come on out. You're free. And it's all him. That's the greater exodus. That's the greater liberation. And as we go through this book, we're going to see all these symbols and all this imagery and all this foreshadowing of the work of Christ for you. And at the root of it is this. You've lived your entire life as if you have to sustain yourself. Yes, you've done bad things, morally speaking, but underneath why you've done bad things is because you have been trying to preserve and to benefit yourself and to improve your life and to find spiritual life for yourself. Craving, chasing. That's what you've done. You've invited for yourself bondage and chains and enslavement. And God says the gospel, the good news is while you're stuck and dead in trespasses and sins, I've come through Jesus to make you alive. So that Christ's cross you're identified with, he says, your sins are covered there. You are granted full pardon, full forgiveness, and given new life and identification with Jesus himself. You're set free. And you now have in him absolutely everything you need for the sustenance of your soul forever, here and for all eternity. That's what this is leading us to. And it sets us up perfect to take communion together. So if I can have Greg and my volunteers come forward, we're going to partake of communion. Patrick, if you'll play for us. Let me pray, give God thanks, and then we'll pass out the bread and the cups to just represent the body and the blood of Christ. Father, thank you for this word in Exodus 1 and what we've looked at back in Genesis, and we see your handiwork, we see your storyline, and we marvel over it. And to think that God, all these years later, that we're part of it, it gives our lives meaning, substance, and a foundation. And it also conveys to us, God, your heart for us, your love for us, to see us in our misery, in our independence, in our apathy, in our rebellion against you, and our failure to see your kindness and generosity, and our going it alone. And you saw us in that state, and you loved us. And you sent Christ, the liberator, to come, to live in our place, to die in our place, so that we could know forgiveness and reconciliation to be restored to you and given new life in you. The greatest message ever proclaimed in this world and ever heard. Thank you that we get to hear it and receive it and to receive new life from you and freedom from you. Thank you that we can taste it in this moment. And God, we want more of that. And most importantly, we look forward to heaven when we go home to be with you and we're finally free from this fallen world and our fallen minds and our fallen bodies. So thank you for what you've done. Pray now as you partake your communion that it would be a time of sweetness to us and refreshment to us even more. In Jesus' name, amen.